Hello! So in this video, I'm going to do a rundown of all the books I read in 2024. I was inspired by a video on YouTube by Angela Collier, who is a physicist, YouTuber, really good. She ran down all of the books she read in 2024, and I was like, I could do that. I wonder how many I read. So I read roughly 65 books, but you see why that's a little bit tricky to count. So, best book of the year by far is A Risky Business, an actuary's guide to quantifying and managing risk in society by Catrin Townsend, who very kindly wrote the foreword for my own book, Price Writer. I think it's a great book. So it's written in a way that just feels like Catrin is explaining these quite complicated things to you in a very nice and kind way. It's not a book that's really for me as a qualified actuary. It's more an introduction for people who want to know what actuarial science is to read through and find out about it. But for example, my dad really wanted me to be an actuary, but he never really understood what it was. So he worked for a life insurance company, and to him, the actuaries were people that sat in offices and got paid a lot. And I'd have loved to have been able to give him the Catrin's book for him to read and understand what my job was. But unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, so I couldn't. But I think Catrin's book is fantastic. I do think it's a good thing to get for your teams in pricing departments. And if anyone's thinking about going through the actuarial exams, they should definitely read the whole of the book, because trust me, you'll enjoy reading Catrin talking about actuarial science in a way that you might well find much more interesting than you will do when you get into the actuarial notes and actually studying for your exams. So that was my favourite book of the year. The next book on my list is Fluke by Dr. Brian Klaas. So it's a book about how pretty much everything in the world is actually just pure luck, random chance. Very little is actually planned and occurs as we expect it. So if you see a time travel story, people go back in time and are absolutely scared of doing anything that may change the past. But we totally don't live our lives as if every single thing we do is going to change our possible future, even though that probably is the case. So, as an example, I've got two friends from university. They are married with a couple of children, and they met in halls. They met because the university system that allocates people into different halls put the two of them together. And that just is such a random thing. If the system had just been coded slightly differently, they may never have met, so their children might never have existed. So it's just a really interesting way of seeing the world and very eye-opening. So next was Escape from Model Land by Erica Thompson. It's quite a good book. I find it a little bit light, but it is quite good at making you think about how our models actually affect the world and how our own thought processes often affect how we build our models. So it's an interesting sort of double layer there. And models are really our interpretations of the world, no matter how much we think the machines have made them or that we've been very dispassionate in the way that we've built them. They are particularly full of our own biases and our own way of viewing the world. So I also read You're Better Than You Think You Are by Sir Rod Aldridge. So he's a business founder. I didn't really enjoy this book very much. I often find some biographies lack any form of consideration of people's lives and perhaps how lucky they were or how they treated other people around them. I just think Rod Aldridge came across as someone who was like, I always did everything correctly, how I thought was the right thing to do stuff. He had a lot of help from the government, which he does talk about, but doesn't really acknowledge how society helped him become extremely rich and build a very big business. So I find that rather strange and almost disappointing, really. I read Blue Ocean Strategy by W. Chan Kim and Renee Mauborgne. I can't remember anything from this book at all. Not at all. I definitely read it. It's about how you should avoid competition. So you've got your sort of red your kind of Red Seas that are full of lots of businesses all fighting it out, very predatory. And you should look for your like blue ocean, so your empty areas where there isn't already lots of businesses already doing stuff where it's really competitive. But honestly, I can't remember a thing of this book beyond that. So I read The Power of Moments by Chip Heath and Dan Heath. I thought it was an interesting book. So they're quite good at taking a concept and making it a very clear step strategy or a very clear step plan through how you should deliver something. And that's really what they do here. So the idea is, particularly in marketing, you've got these moments where you can capture people's attention. So it comes about because when people go on holiday, generally you remember like the best thing that happened and you might remember the start or the end of the holiday. So it's really about pandering to those particular moments where people will engage with your product or your marketing. I read Enzo Ferrari by Luca Del Monte about the founder of Ferrari. I didn't take a lot away from this book. I think it's just another one where my own life is so different to these people that founded particular businesses. I just don't really cross over with them. I read The Diary of a CEO by Stephen Bartlett. It's okay. It's actually sort of 33 marketing tips, and some of them are okay. I read Churchill by Andrew Roberts, which kicked off quite a long series that we're going to do in a second on Second World War books. Churchill, he's a guy that was born into a very privileged family who then lived an extremely privileged life and rose to be the leader of the country in that pretty typical prime minister story for like most of the people that seem to have ruled the UK. I didn't take a lot away from this. I didn't really feel like, wow, there's a life I could emulate or in any way learn from. I read Normandy 44 by James Holland. It was brutal. It's a very in-depth explanation of the conflict in Normandy between D-Day and really when they finally broke out and retook France. It's good. It's in depth. I did like it. I did take quite a lot away from it. I also read D-Day by Antony Beevor and Stalingrad by Antony Beevor as well. They are both, again, very in-depth, blow by blow, day by day accounts of these conflicts. Stalingrad is brutal, really grim, and the thing I really took away from it is that the reason the Russians and Germans lost so many people in the war is just the terrible way they fought it. It's absolutely grueling and grinding. The Russians are fighting a war in the middle of the 20th century on horseback because they just don't have supplies. And the Germans as well, they just don't have the equipment that they need. An absolutely grueling and shocking conflict. I don't think I'd recommend other people to read it unless you're really interested in the conflict. All right, Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose. I really liked that actually. I thought it was a good way that it focused on a relatively small number of people and how they fought the war. And you do get a sense of the camaraderie between them. And it is a story full of characters. You will like some people more than others. It's interesting just how the background is so different for the soldiers, but how they did end up coming together and really developing as a unit. You really take home from it, especially reading it after Stalingrad, is how the Americans fought is so incredibly different, and the Brits as well, to how the Germans and the Russians fought each other. So we were super well trained before we even went into combat. We had lots of supplies. We didn't advance until we had very comfortably built supply routes for our troops. We genuinely cared about the troops and didn't want to en masse throw people into what were meat grinders in Stalingrad. So it's just the real contrast. And actually, one of the reasons I think the death toll was so much lower for the UK and the USA is the way that we fought was just completely different and much more sensible, in my view, way of fighting. I also read D-Day by Stephen Ambrose, fairly similar to Band of Brothers. I then switched to The Battle of the Atlantic by Jonathan Dimbleby. This was a great book, actually. I will definitely read more by Jonathan Dimbleby. And I don't I didn't really know any detail about the battle for the Atlantic. And I think the thing that's really amazing about it for me is the way that the Allies are really on the ropes trying to supply Europe and the UK, and it prevents them from doing any action like in re-invading the continent, retaking back and liberating the continent. And then really very suddenly it turns for them, and largely because of technology. So improved radar, improved ships, lots of technological improvements, sudden improvements in depth charges and sonar, and all of it just seems to come together at once. And they turn the tide of the war really suddenly in the Atlantic. And quite quickly, the U-boats go from being the victors to being penned in and able to actually leave and fight. And it just really, again, shows the difference in the way that we fought the wars and the power of science and technology. I also read Masters of the Air by Donald Miller. I watched the Apple show as well. I thought it was good. I can't remember a great deal from it. I think that the book was quite similar to the TV show, so it just crossed over so much that I didn't really take that much away from the book. And the last war one I read is Sicily 43. I read that whilst I was in Greece, actually, but I had been to Sicily before. I had no idea how brutal the fighting was on Sicily. And again, it's quite blow by blow. It's a very in-depth analysis. So I then finished with Second World War books. So next one, another one I read on holiday. It's Becoming Superman by J. Michael Straczynski. So he's the creator of Babylon 5, as well as the author of several successful Hollywood films. I found the guy brilliant, really inspiring. And he grew up in the 50s in the US. And often I think we have this like rose-tinted view of the 50s as this real time of prosperity, this like golden age of Americana. But J. Michael Straczynski's life was brutal. He had a very poor upbringing. He was very abused by his parents and people around him. And yet he turned that into such a positive thing in his life, which is why it's called Becoming Superman. He really embodied being the opposite of this terrible upbringing that he had. And he just is a nice person. He's created such great things. And I really take away from it, he's just like, right. Because that's what he's famous for, writing. And he just writes really prolifically. And he'll go back and edit and make something really wonderful. But he's like, just write and write and write and write. Don't get hung up. Don't stop. Don't think too much. Just keep writing and then sort it out later. And I just found that really inspiring. But he's a great guy. Then I read Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. It's a good book. It really brings home the just awful nature of communism and the perverse way the whole system was set up to be so much more about pretending mistakes never or couldn't or never would happen or hadn't happened than actually dealing with the realities of both a nuclear industry and a nuclear disaster. I found it great. It's really in depth, really detailed account. There's like 100 pages of in the bibliography. It's absolutely brilliant book. I read Challenger by Adam Higginbotham as well. I didn't think this one was as good, although it was really eye-opening for me to consider, like, being someone born in the 80s, to actually consider how these two things happen quite close together and have similarities between them. So Challenger came about really because of a lot of hubris in the NASA and a system where they just believed they're extremely good at things and nothing could go wrong. I really think as a book, it flags for the middle third, probably. It seems there's a good couple of 100 pages that are just the couple of days leading up to the launch of Challenger. And I can see why it needs to be very much a book that's about that. But it's really minute by minute with quite a large cast of characters, and it does get drags, really. I read Super Communicators by Charles de Higg. So I can't actually remember particularly any of the things that were in it. I think it was good, and I think I took stuff away from it, but I can't actually remember anything specific from it. I read Methods of Persuasion by Nick Calander and Imagine Reading This Book by Nick Calander as well. I thought these were really good. It's got a lot of genuine tips about marketing and psychology and how to have more of an impact with the work that you do and the messages that you present. And it's very much based on kind of a list of things you can do or tactics. And I just found it really useful. It's got things you can really put into practice. I read Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. He's very good. So he also wrote Persuasion and other psychology books. It's very good. It's very long, but it's really jam-packed with a lot of good quality research, often that he's was the academic involved in. So it's pretty impressive that he turns what he's done in his academic work into a book that's really readable by people to understand how marketing works, or marketing professionals to understand how to be more effective, or just people in their everyday life with how they can be more persuasive and more effective at delivering their message to people and engaging well. Lots of really useful, really practical tips in there. I read The Challenger Sale by Matthew Dixon and Brent Adamson. I find this pretty dull. So it's very dry, management-y book and didn't really do it for me. I read Dark Psychology and Manipulation by Lucas Bailey. It really is quite a dark book. It really does make you think about some of the nasty stuff that goes on in the world, particularly to try and get us to buy stuff, but also to keep us addicted to social media and computer games as well. Quite nasty, actually. I don't recommend this one because I think you can take away a lot of the message about the psychology without it needing to be such a negative way of presenting it. I read The Illusion of Choice by Richard Shotton, so another psychology book, and this one looking at, again, how we're manipulated by the world around us. I read The Charisma Myth by Olivia Fox-Cabane. It was good, actually. So the premise there is that rather than charisma being something people are born with, it's actually something that you can study and learn as if it's a skill. So it's not really even knowledge, it's about skills. And I thought it was quite believable, actually. I found it to be quite a believable presentation. I've not necessarily found the actual things she suggested doing to be that effective, but it's on the whole a good book. I read Want by Gillian Anderson, which I'm not going to talk any more about. It's definitely not appropriate for work. I read Sarah Davis' book, so she's from Dragon's Den. We Can All Make It. I like this one, actually. I really like Sarah. I definitely relate to her in a way that I did not relate to the other two people's biographies I mentioned. She is super down to earth. Felt like it's quite a similar background in life to me, actually. And I think the way she went about business to be really cool. Just very focused, very listens to customers, and very much wants to make products that people actually use and enjoy using. So I really liked her, and I liked her as a person as well. I read Single Minded, which is Claude Littner's book from The Apprentice. It's the second time I've read that one, actually. I really like Claude's book. I think he's a really great person as well. It gets a little bit boardroomy and a little bit corporate towards the end. He starts off very much entrepreneurial, and he doesn't gloss over it. He makes some really big business mistakes. loses money, largely his own money. And then he moves more into quite a corporate world. And by the end of it, it's extremely boardroomy. And I didn't relate to that as much, just because that's not something I find as fun as the entrepreneurial side of business. But I do like him as a person. I think he's really quite clever. He's articulate in his book. He's got very good business kind of ethics. And yeah, I think that's a good book. Very inspirational. So now we move on to the fiction books that I read. So I read all 8 of the Expanse books, one after another. That was towards the start of the year. So there's Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. I thought this one was really good, actually. It's quite a basic story in a lot of ways, and it's very much influenced and inspired by noir stories from kind of the mid 20th century USA. And it really works. So although it's a sci-fi setting, the genre is almost detective fiction and action orientated as well. So I think it's quite good. In fact, yeah, I think it's a good book. I liked it a lot, but let's say it's got a surprisingly basic story as well. So I then read Caliban's War, so the second Expanse book. This one is good. I think it's probably not as good as Leviathan Wakes, but it's all right. It feels like a bridge in a way between the first story and the rest of what's going to happen. So it's one of those kind of setting things up books, which is surprising because it's quite long. So I then read Abaddon's Gate. I think this is probably my favourite of the 8 books, or perhaps second favourite. So it's a book with a lot of mystery. It's a book with a lot of like realistic physics, and it's got a lot of action in it as well. So I think it's probably my preferred one. I would definitely recommend it. I mean, I recommend reading all 8 because you need to appreciate the whole thing. But I particularly recommend that one, the third book, as being probably my favourite. Then it was Cibola Burn. This is good as well, actually. It's got the mystery aspects. It's very kind of influenced by the sort of Wild West and the settlers and the pioneers in the USA in the 19th century. It also confronts a lot of the reality of what it'd be like being so far away from Earth and able to communicate in sort of real time with just the light delay to get messages back, but for you to be unable to affect anything at home and for them to be unable to affect anything with you, it's an interesting look at how that would really function. And yeah, I think it's okay. The next 2 books, Nemesis Games, is okay. It's an interesting change in the way that it's written, which I don't want to do any spoilers, but it's all right. It's quite a big change of setting as well. It's sudden kind of change in the way that the story works, but it's okay. Babylon's Ashes is my least favorite of the lot. I found it long, quite plodding. It ends really with a kind of ghost in the machine, Deus Ex Machina, or everything's okay in the end. That felt slightly lazy on the part of the author. I mean, ultimately, when people write these, they get to decide what happens. And it just felt like they didn't really know how they were going to sort this one out. So then they Easter egg throughout the story a way that it could all just be solved at the end in a really quite tidy, nice kind of way. It just didn't feel like it worked for me. So there's then quite another kind of change in the way the story works for the next 3 books. There's quite a time jump between them. So next one's Persepolis Rising. It's to me a bit like Caliban's War. It's just a setup, even though it's quite a long book, it just feels like it's setting up the pieces for the finale of the story. It's okay. There's a bit of action in it. It's quite a good read. But yeah, I don't think it's towards the bottom of the ranking for me. Then we come to Tiamat's Wrath, which is also my favourite of them, or maybe my second favourite. It's really hard to choose between that and Abaddon's Gate. This is a great book. The way all the characters have been built up for so long, so carefully, really comes together. It is full of action. There's twists, there's surprises. You keep guessing. It's tense. You can be on your seat. You can wonder really where the story's going to go. I really like this one actually. It was well worth reading the rest of them to get to such a great book. And then the last one is Leviathan Falls. It's not it's okay, and it does have a satisfying ending. It's again kind of long for the amount of story that's actually contained within it, but it's good. And let's say, it is a satisfying ending. I would recommend all eight of them. They are good books. So then, having read a bunch of fiction, I don't very often read fiction, but I really wanted to read these Expanse books. So I was like, oh yeah, fiction's great, brilliant. I want to read more fiction. So then I read The Three Body Problem. I'm sorry to say it, I do not understand why people like this book. I think it's partly came because I just read 8 pretty good sci-fi books. So I was like, yeah, I'll read another sci-fi book. And yeah, I found this one dull. The bits I found most interesting were finding out about the Cultural Revolution and things I didn't know about life in China in the sort of fairly recent past, mostly within my kind of lifetime or a little bit before. But the sci-fi wasn't interested in. A lot of it just felt really contrived. I know that people say it's great that it uses realistic physics, but I'm not really sure that's true. And I feel like the physics is used in a way that's just contrived to make the plot work. So no, I do not recommend this, and I don't get it. The last third of the book just it feels like he just wanted to summarize. Like it's just so high level and fast paced and fitting in so much going on that it's like just reading many Wikipedia articles one after another. So I read Pompeii by Robert Harris. Robert Harris is one of the few fiction authors I will always read when he's got a new book out. He is a bit hit and miss though. His good books are really very good, but his few small number of misses I just are not great. Pompeii, it's odd. I realised I hadn't read this one, so I read everything else, but there's one I hadn't read, which is odd because as it turns out, we owned it. So we're not sure which one of us it belonged to actually. Perhaps I've been gifted it at some point in the past, but yeah, so it's all right. It's in the sort of top end, but it's not one of his knockout brilliant ones, but it's not bad either. So whilst I was reading the Battle of the Atlantic, I also read Greyhound by C.S. Forrester. It's about a warship captain during an Atlantic crossing. It's good. It certainly brings to life what it would have been like. It's quite grueling. You are put into his head when he has to make decisions with a definite lack of sufficient information, very high levels of uncertainty. And a lot of the time it's a payoff. So he has to move his pieces around, but he doesn't know what's right. It's always trade-offs. So if he does move his fighting ships away from the convoy to chase down a threat, then he leaves the convoy in danger. If he splits his forces, then he probably can't defeat the enemy. It's good, actually. It's very good. I read The Roommate by Rosie Dunnan. I read this on holiday. I'm not going to talk much about it because it's another one that's not appropriate for work. And then I did another couple of sci-fi actually. So I reread, but I've not read them for years. Prelude to Foundation, Foundation in Empire, and Second Foundation. So they're Isaac Asimov books. They are good. The thing with Asimov is that the concepts are really good, but the characters and the narrative is often quite basic and not terribly exciting. The characters are very light. with the exception probably of a couple of the characters in Second Foundation, actually. For the most part, they are not deep characters, and the situations are not deep and not well fleshed out. There's very little description as well. You very much have to fill that in with your own imagination. But what Asimov's very good at, and a lot of people fail to appreciate this, is giving you what seems like a very concrete, clever, scientific concept that solves a lot of problems and then breaking it. So Foundation's about this idea of being able to mathematically predict the future, but it very quickly goes wrong. And it's only rescued actually by the existence of telepaths, which is quite unscientific. I don't want to give spoilers for the story, but it's very interesting how Asimov does this. And similar with the robot stories. So people think to themselves, oh, the three laws of robotics, that's a really logical, sensible idea. That's a way in which we can control robots and AI and stuff. But it's just not true. Nearly all of the robot stories about how the three laws don't work for various reasons. They're all about the conflicts that robots or the masters of robots end up with because of the existence of these three laws. There's a very good one where robots are used to actually commit a murder because there's just ways of manipulating these laws in order to make that happen. But it's really cleverly worked out. And that's the thing with Asimov. It's often really cleverly worked out. And some of the mystery twists are actually really quite good. But as I say, the narrative and the plotting can often be very light. Now, my last fiction book was Precipice by Robert Harris. And that is very much the opposite. This was very good. Really good, Robert Harris. It's about the build up to the First World War. It's told through the eyes of the Prime Minister's mistress, and it is a really good book. You feel like you are there. And there are some things that are absolutely true. It's based on primary sources of evidence that are absolutely jaw-droppingly shocking, how the Prime Minister and the cabinet and the people around them made decisions, and some of the choices they made that have put words into our language to describe the fighting during the First World War. And the way they made the choices are horrifying. So the last three fiction books I read are all dual language books. So they're all in English and French. So I'm going to France in August, and I've not actually spoken French since we moved back. So that's about 10 years ago. So I thought it probably a good idea to check in and see if I was any good at understanding it. So yeah, so three dual language books. They're pretty typical of dual language books. So they're all short story books. They're good for learning a language, but they're not particularly good for enjoying short stories. So there's French short stories by Lingo Mastery. There's short stories in French by Ollie Richards and Richard Simcock. And there's French sci-fi short stories by Sebastian Coutelot. I can't remember anything from the first one at all. I think there was actually, I remember there being a joke at one point about someone drinking from Julius Caesar's fountain somewhere in France, and how if the water's good enough for Julius Caesar, then it's good enough for him. Yeah, so the second one, short stories in French, it's okay. Some of the stories are vaguely interesting. They're more kind of situational than narrative based and kind of conversations, but it's okay. The French sci-fi short stories, I think there was 2 or 3 that were all right. Some of them were just really high level, really basic stories. Some of them just had massive gaping plot holes where you're like, that doesn't work scientifically, or why in the world would that person behave like that? It makes no sense. So that's it. So that was it for the fiction books. So now it's the books that I read to my children. So for my daughter, I read Skin in the Game by Jane Vervand, the entrepreneur behind Dermalogica. This was very good. So her business life really started off when she was freezing cold in her flat in Scotland. I think it was in Glasgow. And she saw an advert in the newspaper to move to South Africa for work, and she just did. And she did a couple of years in South Africa, and then her and her husband decided to go to California, and they just did, and they started that business. It's very much a story of working hard at something, building something. She definitely sees a vision, and she also is not in any way put off by what we might call existing wisdom of things, or in many ways the opinions of other people. She just kind of goes for it, and it works out for her. Partly maybe there's some elements of luck, but I think she's very much someone who sees lots of pieces and lots of experience in her world or different people, and kind of brings it together to make new things. And she describes it as joining up the dots, and I think that's a good way of putting it. So I really like this one. I also genuinely found it inspirational. I read I Am Malalia by Malalia Yousafzai. This is quite grueling. I skipped over a couple of parts of it because I just felt my daughter wouldn't deal with it that well. It is a real eye-opener to the reality of a young woman in kind of oppressive regime in the world, and also the plight of people that flee. And for me, she is a really inspirational person. Her story is harrowing, but also ends up very well. It kind of does make you feel pride. But yeah, very good. Quite a dark read. I wouldn't suggest reading it to a child. It's probably okay for a teenager. I also read Jo Malone, My Story. So Jo Malone, the founder of the perfume company. I found her brilliant. So the book is in kind of three stages. There's the original founding of her first business. There's her coping with illness, very serious illness in the middle. And then the last third is her setting up her second business. And it's good. She admits to her failings in a way that I really like. It's also quite reflective. You sense she's telling you about the lessons that she learned. And in that way, it's a pretty good biography. So yeah, I would definitely recommend Jane Malone's book. It's great for a kind of young, for a child. I think they can really appreciate it. So yeah, I definitely recommend that one. I read The Trials of Life, the David Attenborough one. My daughter's very into biology. I liked it. It's not necessarily my subject, but I thought it was good. I think it's one you can read to. My daughter's about 9, so I think it's one that you can read to someone of about that age. And she's really into biology, so it worked quite well. It's okay. I also read World War One and Two: History for Kids from the History Brought Alive series. So that tied in with the series I went on to look at this. It's I didn't find it that interesting in the way that it's meant to be for children. I think it could have been a lot more interesting and engaging. It had a certain list of names and dates about it, which I didn't think was brilliant, as it is a massive, sprawling subject. So, yeah, I don't think I'd recommend that one. I also read Clan the Princess Bride. So it is a book as well as a film. I think it's really quite good actually. It's a great film. It's a good book. There is the wraparound story in the film is kind of a boy. I think it's being read a story by, I think it might be Peter Falk actually. It's a while since I've seen it, but It's a boy who's ill being read the story by his grandfather. The wraparound story in the book is different, but I think it really works. It's very cleverly done. It's very meta. I liked it a lot, actually. So, to my son, I read various Tintin books. I found them kind of disappointing as an adult, actually. The particularly kind of Tintin when he goes to the moon, so Destination Moon, it's got plot twists in it that you can just see coming so far off, and you end up feeling like, why are the characters so foolish that it didn't occur to them what was going on? When they actually go to the moon, they take it in their giant rocket, a huge heavy metal tank to ride around the moon in, and the logic of it just doesn't work for me. And similarly, the other stories, it could be really inconsistent in the characters. So Tintin can be really inept at times, or he can be really insightful and clever at other times. It's just not kind of a clear character. And the same with the captain, he could just be really like inconsistent. And I feel a bit like it would be funnier if they stuck to their stereotypes, but I guess that wouldn't work well for the narrative always. I mean, it's obviously it's for children. I read Star Wars In the Shadow of Yavin. So it's a graphic novel. We liked it, actually. So I'd read it before, but I read it in French years ago. So it was quite interesting to then read it in English out loud to my son as well. I think in French it's L'Ombre de Yavin, so same title. Yeah, it's a good book. I liked it. It's in the Legend series, so I no, I just think it's one of those ones where they're like, oh, that's never happened. But you can still buy it, and it's still a good story. Lovely artwork as well. I read some of the Wizard of Oz collection, say by L. Frank Baum. I think it was the first couple of books, might have been maybe 3 or 4 of them. I don't remember it that clearly. I mean, it's kind of a fantasy set in this land of Oz. The thing I did take away with it is thinking about it in the time it was written, because like it kind of comes across as the wizard is kind of like the US president, might be Theodore Roosevelt, it might be slightly earlier than that, but the idea that it's kind of a guy who is supposedly working all these levers and power and stuff, but actually isn't really that powerful and isn't really doing anything kind of good. And the way that Oz is quite an agrarian society is very like about kind of that agrarian lifestyle from the US from kind of 120 years ago. So in that way, it's quite interesting in the kind of cultural aspects of the United States society that it kind of about. So I wouldn't recommend it particularly, but it was okay. I also read The Princess Bride to my son. I read him The Adventures of Parsley the Lion. He's very into a lot of the TV from when I was a child. He's quite gentle in that way. So yes, we read books about past. It's quite a nice story, actually. They've taken each of the original episodes, made it into a story, but they've actually modernized it. So it works for me, and I think it works for kind of an audience nowadays. And he's also watched them, so it connects together in that way. I also read to Mo, I read in the Book of Sing, so Sing, the DreamWorks film, and I read in the Book of Wonka. He really likes the books of films. I do not like reading the books of films. Both of them are just scene for scene, word for word, action for action, exactly what happened in the film. And that's just not a very exciting read to me. So we're nearly there. The last 2 books are ones I read to both of my children when we were on holiday. So when we were in Greece, I read to them My Family and Other Animals, the Jared Durrell. So I think I read this when I was in my 20s, and I remember it being a lot more funny And I remember it being a lot more about his kind of family and his adventures going to Greece. In reality, it's actually many, many pages describing the flora and fauna of Greece. And it's quite interesting. It's certainly quite good to read to two kids on holiday when you want them to go to sleep. It goes on a lot. So not really, not as good as I remember it being. It is funny, but it's not really funny. And final one, Kensuke's Kingdom, the Michael Morpurgo book. I thought this was excellent, really good. A great kids book, but really enjoyable as an adult as well. Really made me think, really moving actually. The interplay between the two main characters is really deep and believable. They really develop a friendship. And the messages about war and about love and about family just are really powerfully done and really understandable by an audience of any age. Very moving book. I definitely recommend this one. So that is the entire year of books that I read. So as I said, 65-ish, but I can't remember how many Oz books I read, and I don't really know how to count the Tintin books. But good year's haul of books, actually. Really good. And on the whole, I was very pleased with most of them. So that's it. So I guess I will see how this video does, and maybe I'll be back in 2026 to tell you about all the books I have read in 2025. Thanks very much and have a good rest of your day.